The raging waters snatched at Hannah Nelson's skirt as she clutched her infant daughter tighter against her chest, desperation fueling her climb up the muddy embankment. April 1875 had brought unprecedented rains to the Texas frontier, transforming the usually docile Brazos River into a roaring beast that devoured everything in its path. Hannah's homestead was already gone, swallowed by the surging floodwaters that had woken her just after midnight. Now she fought for two lives her own and that of 6-month-old Emma, whose terrified cries pierced the thunderous rumble of the flood. "Hold on, Emma," Hannah whispered, her voice breaking as her foot slipped, sending her to her knees in the slick mud. The cold water pulled at her legs, threatening to drag both mother and child back into its churning depths. The baby wailed louder, her tiny face red with fear as raindrops pelted her cheeks. "Please, God," Hannah prayed, struggling to find purchase on the slippery slope. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the storm's fury. Through the curtain of rain, Hannah glimpsed a silhouette on horseback racing along the ridge above them. The rider spotted her and immediately changed course, guiding his mount down the treacherous slope with skilled precision. "Madam, hold on." A deep voice called out as the horse splashed through the shallows. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, water hitting mid-thigh as he waded toward her. "I've got you." Hannah could barely make out his features in the darkness, just the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat and broad shoulders beneath a rain-soaked duster. His strong hands reached for her just as another surge of water swept her feet out from under her. Emma's scream tore through the night as Hannah felt herself falling backward toward the raging current. The stranger lunged forward, one arm encircling her waist while his other hand cradled her arms that held the baby. "I've got you both," he assured, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. With seemingly impossible strength, he half-carried, half-dragged Hannah up the slippery bank, his boots finding purchase where her worn shoes could not. Emma's cries grew softer as they climbed higher, away from the hungry floodwaters. "My baby," Hannah gasped when they finally reached higher ground, her arms trembling from exhaustion and fear. "Your baby is safe," the man said firmly, helping Hannah sit on a fallen log a safe distance from the rising water. He looked down at the infant who had quieted to whimpering hiccups, then back at Hannah's pale, mud-streaked face. "You'll both live, I swear it." The conviction in his voice made Hannah look up properly for the first time. Lightning flashed, illuminating a face weathered by sun and wind, but not by years. He couldn't be much older than her own 24 years. Kind eyes met hers beneath the soaked brim of his hat. "Jake Northrop, madam," he introduced himself, taking off his hat briefly before the driving rain forced him to replace it. "Where were you headed before the water caught you?" "Nowhere," Hannah admitted, adjusting her grip on Emma and trying to shield the baby from the relentless rain. "Our house is gone. Everything's gone. I was just trying to reach higher ground." Jake scanned the horizon, then glanced at his horse who stood nearby, head lowered against the storm. "My ranch is about 3 miles north of here." "Not much to look at, but it's on high ground and the roof doesn't leak." He hesitated. "Madam, I don't mean to be forward, but you and your little one need shelter." Hannah hesitated only briefly. The alternatives were non-existent. "Thank you, Mr. Northrop. I'm Hannah Nelson, and this is Emma." Jake nodded. "Mrs. Nelson, can you ride?" Yes, but she looked at Emma, then at the horse. Understanding her concern, Jake removed his duster and fashioned a makeshift sling across Hannah's chest. "This will help secure her while we ride. You'll hold her, and I'll hold you both." Once Emma was secured against Hannah's chest, Jake helped them both onto his horse before mounting behind her. Hannah felt the warmth of his chest against her back as his arms reached around her to take the reins, creating a protective barrier. "Lean back if you need to," he said quietly near her ear. "I won't let either of you fall." The journey to Jake's ranch was slow and treacherous. The rain continued its assault, and twice they had to detour around areas where the flooding had made the trail impassable. Emma eventually fell asleep, lulled by the rocking motion and the warmth of the improvised sling. Hannah found herself drifting in and out of consciousness, the adrenaline of their escape giving way to bone-deep exhaustion. She startled awake when Jake spoke again. "There it is." "Not much, but it's home." Through the rain, Hannah could make out the silhouette of a modest ranch house with a barn and corral nearby. As they drew closer, she saw that while it wasn't grand, the place was well-maintained, a testament to its owner's character. Jake dismounted first, then reached up to help Hannah and Emma down. He led them quickly to the porch, fumbling briefly with the door before ushering them inside. The interior was simple but clean: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and doors leading to what Hannah presumed were bedrooms. Jake immediately moved to the fireplace, working quickly to light a fire. "You both need to get warm and dry," he said, not looking up from his task. "There's a bedroom through that door. You'll find some clothes in the chest. They belonged to my sister before she married and moved to Fort Worth." The kindling caught, and Jake added larger pieces of wood. "They might be big on you, but they're dry." Hannah stood dripping on the wooden floor, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look. "Mr. Northrop, I don't know how to thank you." Jake straightened, the fire now crackling steadily. "No need for thanks. Nobody should be out in weather like this, especially not a mother and baby." He gestured to the bedroom again. "Go on and change. I'll make some coffee and heat some stew." In the bedroom, Hannah gently laid Emma on the bed, surrounding her with pillows to prevent her from rolling. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Hannah quickly stripped off her sodden clothes, using a towel from the washstand to dry herself before pulling on a simple cotton dress from the chest. It was indeed a bit large, but blessedly dry. She found a smaller towel to gently dry Emma, changing her into one of the few items she'd managed to grab before fleeing a clean nightdress. When Hannah emerged from the bedroom with Emma in her arms, Jake had set 2 bowls of steaming stew on the table, along with mugs of coffee. He'd changed, too, into a dry flannel shirt and denims, though his dark hair was still damp and curled slightly at his collar. "I'm afraid I don't have anything proper for the little one," Jake said, looking somewhat chagrined. Never had cause to keep baby things around. Hannah smiled for the first time that night. "I have her bag. It's not much, but I grabbed it on our way out." She indicated the small cloth satchel that had somehow remained slung across her body throughout their ordeal. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds being the crackling fire, the relentless rain on the roof, and Emma's occasional soft noises as she slept in Hannah's arms. "Were you alone at your place?" Jake finally asked, his tone careful. "Is there someone we should try to find once the storm passes?" Hannah shook her head. "No, my husband Thomas died last fall, pneumonia. He never even got to see Emma born." She swallowed hard, pushing back the grief that still ambushed her at unexpected moments. "We had a small farm by the river. I've been managing it myself since then." Jake's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Nelson. Thank you, and please call me Hannah." Jake nodded. "Hannah, then," he hesitated. "The river's been rising for days. When did you realize you needed to leave?" "Too late," Hannah admitted. "I thought our land was high enough. By the time I realized the danger, water was already coming under the door." She shuddered at the memory. "I only had time to grab Emma and her bag before the walls started giving way." Jake's face grew serious. "The Brazos is unforgiving when it floods. You're lucky to be alive." "Not luck," Hannah corrected quietly. "Providence and you." The conversation lulled, and Hannah noticed Emma stirring, the baby's face scrunched in that familiar way that preceded hunger. "Is there somewhere I can feed her?" Hannah asked, suddenly aware of the intimacy sharing a small cabin with a stranger entailed. "Of course, use the bedroom," Jake said, standing quickly. "I'll clean up here and check on the animals." He grabbed his hat and coat. "Take all the time you need." After tending to Emma's needs, Hannah found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. The events of the night, combined with the warmth of the cabin and the fullness in her stomach, made it nearly impossible to stay awake. She must have dozed off because she woke with a start to find Jake gently placing a blanket over her and Emma, who was now sleeping soundly against her chest. "I didn't mean to wake you," he whispered. "You should take the bed, it'll be more comfortable." Hannah shook her head. "We've imposed enough, this is fine." Jake looked like he wanted to argue but instead nodded. "I'll be in the other room if you need anything. Try to get some rest." The next morning dawned gray but with noticeably less rain. Hannah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and the soft murmur of a deep voice. She opened her eyes to see Jake sitting in a chair by the fire, holding Emma and speaking to her in low, serious tones. "And that's why a good horse is worth more than gold out here, little miss," he was saying. "When you're older, I'll teach you to ride. Every Texas girl should know how." The tenderness in the scene made Hannah's throat tight. It had been so long since she'd seen a man with her child Thomas had never had the chance. Jake looked up and caught her watching. A flush crept up his neck. "She was fussing and you were sleeping so soundly. I hope you don't mind." "Not at all." Hannah sat up, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "Has she been awake long?" "Just a little while. She's quite the conversationalist." Jake smiled down at Emma, who was contentedly grasping at his finger. "I made breakfast, if you're hungry." Over a simple meal of bacon, biscuits, and coffee, they discussed their situation. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but Jake warned that the flooding would likely worsen before it improved, as water from upstream made its way down the Brazos. "You're welcome to stay here until it's safe," he offered. "It's not much, but there's plenty of food, and Emma seems comfortable enough." Hannah felt a rush of gratitude mixed with discomfort at being so indebted to a man she barely knew. "That's very generous, but I don't want to impose." "Perhaps there's a town nearby where we could find lodging." Jake shook his head. "Nearest town is Granbury, and the road there crosses 3 creeks that are surely flooded by now. Even if we could make it, the town itself sits low, might be underwater already." He paused, seeming to sense her hesitation. "I understand your concern, madam. If it makes you more comfortable, I can sleep in the barn, but in good conscience, I can't send you and your baby out in this weather with nowhere to go." Hannah felt ashamed at her implied mistrust. This man had saved their lives and shown nothing but kindness. "No, please, that won't be necessary. We're grateful for your hospitality, truly. She trailed off, unsure how to express her feelings. "You just don't know me," Jake finished for her. "That's fair enough. Time will remedy that, I expect." He stood and gathered their plates. "For now, know that you and Emma are safe here for as long as you need." The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. The rain continued intermittently, and the news they received from occasional passing riders confirmed that the flooding was extensive throughout the county. Hannah's farm was certainly gone, though Jake was careful not to dwell on this fact in their conversations. Jake spent mornings tending to his small herd of cattle and the handful of horses in his stable, while Hannah kept the cabin in order and cared for Emma. In the afternoons, when Jake returned, they would often sit on the porch if the weather allowed, watching the distant floodwaters and talking. Hannah learned that Jake had come to Texas 5 years earlier, after serving briefly in the Army following the war. He'd worked as a ranch hand until saving enough to buy this small spread 2 years ago. He lived alone, but spoke fondly of his sister Margaret in Fort Worth, and brothers scattered across Kansas and Colorado. In turn, Hannah shared stories of her childhood in Tennessee, her journey west with Thomas after their wedding, and their dreams for the small farm they'd purchased along the Brazos. She found it surprisingly easy to talk to Jake, his quiet attentiveness drawing out thoughts she'd kept to herself for too long. "Do you think you'll try to rebuild?" Jake asked one evening as they sat before the fire, Emma sleeping soundly in a makeshift cradle he'd constructed from an old wooden crate padded with blankets. Hannah sighed. "I don't know. Even if there's anything left of our land, I don't have the money to start over. And farming alone with a baby." She shook her head. "It was hard enough before the flood." Jake nodded thoughtfully, poking at the fire. "What will you do instead?" "Find work, I suppose. I can sew, cook, clean. Once we can reach town, I'll look for a position somewhere." The prospect filled her with dread, not for the work itself, but for what it might mean for Emma. Women with positions as maids or cooks rarely could keep their children with them. As if reading her thoughts, Jake said quietly, "Must be hard, thinking of working while caring for a little one." "It is," Hannah admitted, "but we'll manage somehow, we have to." A week passed, then another. The rains finally stopped completely and the floodwaters began a slow retreat. Jake rode out each day, checking roads and gathering news. The reports were grim. Much of the county had been devastated, homes washed away, livestock drowned, crops ruined. One evening, Jake returned looking particularly somber. He removed his hat and coat slowly, as if delaying something unpleasant. "I rode past your land today," he said finally, sitting across from Hannah at the table. "The house is gone, Hannah. There's nothing left but mud and debris. I'm sorry." Though she'd expected this news, hearing it confirmed made it real in a way Hannah hadn't been prepared for. Tears welled in her eyes, not so much for the modest structure itself, but for the life it represented, the home she and Thomas had made together, the place where she'd given birth to Emma, the future they'd planned within those simple walls. "Thank you for checking," she managed, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. Jake reached across the table hesitantly, then seemed to think better of it and withdrew his hand. "The whole area's a mess. They're saying it might be weeks before some roads are passable again." Hannah nodded, trying to gather herself. "I should start thinking about where to go once we can travel. Perhaps Fort Worth or Dallas would offer better opportunities for work." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "There's another option if you'd consider it." Hannah looked up, puzzled. "You could stay here," Jake continued. "Not as a guest, but as my partner in this place." He rushed on before she could respond. "I know it's not much compared to what you had, but the land is good and the house is sound. There's room for Emma to grow, and I could use the help running things." Hannah stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was suggesting. "Are you proposing a business arrangement?" Jake's face flushed slightly. "In part, yes, but I won't pretend there isn't more to it." He met her eyes directly now. "I've grown fond of you and Emma, Hannah, very fond. I know it hasn't been long and your heart may still belong to your husband's memory. I respect that. But if you stayed, I'd hope that in time, you might come to see me as more than just the man who pulled you from the flood." Hannah felt her heart racing. She'd been so focused on survival, on figuring out their next steps, that she'd barely acknowledged the growing warmth she felt in Jake's presence, the way her spirits lifted when he entered a room, the sense of rightness she felt watching him with Emma. "Jake, she began, unsure what to say. "This is unexpected. I know," he said quickly. "And I don't expect an answer now. Take all the time you need to think about it. Whatever you decide, you and Emma have a place here until you're ready to move on, no strings attached." That night, Hannah lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep beside her. Jake's proposition turned over and over in her mind. Was it too soon to consider such a thing? Thomas had been gone less than a year. Yet in that moment by the flood, when Jake had sworn to save them both, something had shifted in her world, as if fate had washed away one life to make room for another. The next morning, Hannah found Jake at the corral, brushing down his chestnut mare. He looked up as she approached, his expression carefully neutral. "Good morning," he greeted. "Sleep well?" "Not really," Hannah admitted. "I've been thinking about your proposal." Jake set down the brush, giving her his full attention. "And I have questions," she said, "practical ones." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'd expect nothing less from you. If I stayed, if we tried to make a life here together, what exactly would that mean? Would we marry? Would Emma be raised as your daughter? What would be expected of me?" Jake leaned against the corral fence, considering her questions seriously. "Yes, I'd want us to marry if that's what you wanted too. As for Emma, I'd be honored to raise her as my own, to give her my name, to be a father to her in every way that matters." He paused. "As for expectations, I believe in partnership, Hannah. This would be our ranch, our home, our life together. I don't need a housekeeper or a cook, though I won't complain about your cooking being better than mine. I need someone to stand beside me, to share in decisions, to build something with." His words resonated with something deep in Hannah's heart. It was how Thomas had viewed their marriage too, as a true partnership. It was rare enough among men that she recognized its value. "And if I say no," she asked softly, "if I choose to leave when the road's clear?" Pain flickered across Jake's features, but he nodded. "Then I'll help you get wherever you want to go, make sure you have what you need to start over. And I'll remember the time you and Emma were here as the best weeks of my life." The simple honesty in his voice moved her more than any elaborate declaration could have. Hannah took a deep breath, knowing her next words would change the course of all their lives. "I don't need to wait for the roads to clear to know what I want," she said. "Thomas would want Emma and me to be happy, to be cared for, and I think I think we could be happy here with you. Jake's eyes widened. Are you saying yes? I'm saying I'd like to try, Hannah clarified. Not a business arrangement, but a real marriage in time. I can't promise my heart will heal as quickly as you might hope, but I can promise to be honest with you, to work alongside you, to build a life here together. The smile that broke across Jake's face was like sunrise after the longest night. That's more than I dared hope for, he said, taking a step toward her. May I? He hesitated, then gestured vaguely between them. Hannah nodded, and Jake closed the distance, taking her hands in his. They were work-roughened but gentle, just as they had been when he'd pulled her from the flood. Thank you for trusting me with your future, he said softly. And Emma's. I swear to you both, I'll do everything in my power to make sure you never regret it. Hannah found herself smiling back, a lightness in her chest that had been absent for longer than she could remember. I believe you will. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the recovering community. Jake rode into town as soon as the roads allowed, returning with a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. The local pastor, making his rounds to check on families affected by the flood, was enlisted to perform a small ceremony on the porch of the ranch house 2 weeks later. Hannah wore the best of Margaret's dresses, a pale blue cotton that Jake said matched her eyes. Emma, propped on the hip of a neighboring rancher's wife who'd come to witness the ceremony, wore a new white gown Jake had somehow procured from town, his first gift to his soon-to-be daughter. The ceremony was brief and unadorned, but as Hannah repeated her vows, she felt a sureness that surprised her. This wasn't the life she'd planned, but standing beside Jake as he promised to cherish and protect her and Emma, she could see a future unfolding that held its own kind of promise. Their wedding night was approached with mutual respect for Hannah's still healing heart. Jake had prepared the main bedroom for her and Emma, insisting on taking the small second bedroom for himself. We have time, he said simply, when Hannah began to apologize. I meant what I said about no expectations. We'll find our way together at whatever pace feels right. Life settled into new patterns as spring gave way to summer. The land recovered from the flood's devastation, green shoots pushing through mud-caked fields, new life emerging from the wreckage. Hannah found it a fitting metaphor for her own heart's slow revival. Jake proved to be everything he'd promised: patient, kind, hardworking, and surprisingly adept with Emma. The baby thrived under their combined care, growing sturdier and more adventurous by the day. Her first steps were taken across the cabin floor, one chubby hand gripping Jake's finger for balance while Hannah watched with tears in her eyes. She's walking, Hannah exclaimed as Emma took 3 wobbly steps before plopping down on her bottom with a giggle. Of course she is, Jake said proudly. She's a Nelson Northrop, stubborn and determined, runs in both bloodlines. He scooped Emma up, tossing her gently in the air to her squealing delight. Next we'll teach you to ride, little lady. Can't have a ranch girl who doesn't know horses. Hannah's heart swelled watching them together. In the 4 months since the flood had brought them together, Jake had never once made her feel that Emma was anything but his own child. He sang to her at night when she was fussy, crafted tiny wooden animals for her to play with, and spoke to her constantly in the same serious, respectful tone he used with adults. One evening in late August, after Emma had been put to bed, Hannah and Jake sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery oranges and pinks. The air was still heavy with summer heat, but a slight breeze made it bearable. I rode past your old place today, Jake said quietly. The river's completely back in its banks now. The land is starting to recover. Hannah nodded. She'd visited once herself several weeks earlier, but found nothing recognizable in the mud-covered plot where her home had stood. Nature has a way of healing itself given time. People too, Jake observed, his eyes finding hers in the fading light. Hannah smiled, acknowledging the truth in his words. Yes, people too. Jake reached for her hand, a gesture that had become comfortable between them. Hannah, I've been thinking. I know we agreed to take things slowly, and I've tried to honor that, but I wanted you to know. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready for our marriage to be a true one in every sense, I'm here. And if that day never comes, I'll still count myself the luckiest man in Texas just to have you and Emma in my life." Hannah squeezed his hand, moved by the sincerity in his voice and the patience he'd shown these past months. In truth, her feelings for Jake had been growing steadily, transforming from gratitude to friendship to something deeper that sometimes caught her by surprise, a flutter in her chest when he entered a room, a longing for his presence when he was away. "Jake," she began softly, "you've given us so much: a home, security, a future. But more than that, you've given me time to heal, to find myself again after losing everything." She turned to face him fully. "I think I'm ready now, not to forget Thomas, but to move forward, to make room in my heart for something new." Jake's expression was a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Are you sure?" "I don't want you to feel any obligation." Hannah silenced him by leaning forward and placing a gentle kiss on his lips there first. It was brief but filled with promise. "I'm sure," she whispered as she pulled away. "I think I've been sure for a while now, just afraid to admit it." That night marked a new beginning in their marriage. With Emma sleeping soundly in her small bed in the corner of the main bedroom, Hannah welcomed Jake into what was now truly their shared room, their shared life. Their coming together was tender and unhurried, a physical expression of the bond that had been forming between them since that fateful night by the flood. Afterward, lying in Jake's arms as moonlight filtered through the window, Hannah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known since before Thomas's illness. This wasn't the life she had planned, but it was a good life, one filled with purpose, partnership, and the promise of love. "What are you thinking?" Jake asked, his fingers gently stroking her hair. "I'm thinking about rivers," Hannah replied truthfully. "How they can destroy everything in their path, but also create new channels, new possibilities." Jake nodded against her head. "That night when I found you in the flood, I was only out because my stupid steer had broken through the fence again. If that hadn't happened..." He tightened his arm around her. "I've never been so grateful for a troublesome animal in my life." Hannah smiled at the thought. Providence works in mysterious ways. As summer gave way to fall, the ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Jake's small herd grew with the addition of cattle purchased at favorable prices from flood-affected neighbors unable to maintain their stock. Hannah planted a substantial vegetable garden and began keeping chickens, reducing their dependence on supplies from town. Emma's first birthday was celebrated with a small gathering of neighbors who had become friends. The little girl, now steady on her feet and beginning to form words, charmed everyone with her bright smile and adventurous spirit. "She's the image of you," remarked Sarah Wilson, whose farm adjoined their property to the east. "Except those eyes," Jake interjected, catching Emma as she toddled past. "Those are all her mother's." Hannah felt a warmth spread through her at his words. Though Jake never tried to replace Thomas in Emma's history, he had seamlessly become her father in every way that mattered. Emma's first clear word had been "Papa," directed at Jake one morning as he'd entered the kitchen, and Hannah had watched with tears in her eyes as the big, strong man had been rendered speechless by that single syllable. Winter brought its own challenges, a series of fierce storms that tested the ranch buildings and livestock, a brief illness that swept through the household, leaving all three of them weak and exhausted for days, and the isolation that came with snow-covered trails and early darkness. Yet even in those difficult moments, Hannah found herself grateful for the life they'd built. On cold evenings, they would gather before the fire, Jake whittling or repairing tack, Hannah sewing or reading from one of the books Jake had surprised her with from his last trip to Fort Worth, and Emma playing contentedly at their feet. It was during one such evening in late January, as wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, that Hannah realized she needed to tell Jake something important. "Jake," she began, setting aside her mending, "there's something we should discuss." He looked up from the bridle he was repairing, his expression immediately concerned. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong, no." Hannah couldn't help smiling at his protective instinct, "but I think we might need to consider adding another bedroom to the house come summer." Jake's brow furrowed in confusion. "Another bedroom? Why would we?" His hands stilled as understanding dawned on his face. "Hannah, are you saying?" She nodded, her smile widening. "I'm fairly certain the baby should arrive sometime in July." The bridle fell forgotten to the floor as Jake crossed to her in 2 long strides, kneeling before her chair. "A baby," he whispered, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The wonder in his voice brought tears to Hannah's eyes. "Yes, our baby. Emma will have a little brother or sister." Jake looked up at her, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I never thought I could be this happy," he confessed. "When I pulled you and Emma from that flood, I was just doing what needed to be done. I never imagined you would become my whole world." Hannah placed her hand over his where it rested on her abdomen. "That night, you told me we would both live. You made me believe it when I'd lost all hope. And now here we are, making a new life together in more ways than one." Jake leaned forward to kiss her gently. "I love you, Hannah Northrop." It was the first time he'd said those words directly, though he'd shown his love in countless ways over the past months. Hearing them now, Hannah felt the last lingering shadows in her heart give way to light. "I love you too, Jake Northrop," she replied, the words feeling right and true on her lips. "More than I ever thought possible again." Spring arrived with its usual Texas vigor wildflowers carpeting the hills, newborn calves wobbling alongside their mothers, and the days stretching longer with promise. Hannah's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body changing to accommodate the new life growing within her. Jake watched these changes with undisguised fascination and pride, his protective instincts heightened to a degree that sometimes made Hannah laugh. "Jake, I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she protested one day as he insisted on carrying a basket of laundry that weighed practically nothing. "Humor me," he replied with a grin. "I missed this part with Emma. I'm making up for lost time." Emma herself seemed to sense the coming change, her small hands often patting Hannah's growing belly as she solemnly declared, "Baby." "That's right, sweetheart," Hannah would confirm. "Your baby brother or sister is in there, growing strong." The room that had been Jake's during those first tentative months of their marriage was transformed into a nursery for the new baby, with Emma's bed to be moved there as well once the infant was old enough to sleep through the night. Jake spent evenings crafting a new cradle, more elaborate than the makeshift one he'd created for Emma during their early days together. As Hannah's due date approached, the anniversary of the flood passed a day that could have been somber, but instead became a celebration of all they'd gained in the year since water had nearly claimed 2 lives and instead had birthed 3 new ones. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked as they sat together on the porch that evening, watching the sunset. "Losing your farm, having to start over," Hannah considered the question seriously. "I regret that I lost the home Thomas and I built together," she answered honestly. "I regret that some of his things, letters, books, the watch that had been his father's, are gone forever." She placed her hand over her rounded belly, feeling the baby shift beneath her palm. "But I can't regret where the flood carried us. This life we've made together is better than anything I could have imagined that night when the waters were rising." Jake's hand covered hers. "Sometimes blessings come disguised as disasters," he observed. "I thank God every day for bringing you and Emma into my life, even though I wish it could have happened some other way." "Perhaps it wouldn't have happened any other way," Hannah mused. "We might have lived our whole lives just miles apart, never knowing what we could have been to each other." The baby arrived on a sweltering July afternoon, after a labor that lasted from dawn until dusk. Jake had insisted on bringing in the doctor from town, despite Hannah's protestations that women had been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time. "Not my wife," Jake had declared, riding out before first light to fetch Dr. Wilson. "Not with my child." Hannah was secretly grateful for his stubbornness when complications arose midday, the baby presenting in a difficult position that required the doctor's experienced hands to navigate. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the cries of a healthy baby boy finally filled the room. "He's perfect," Dr. Wilson announced, placing the squalling infant on Hannah's chest. "A fine, strong son." Jake, who had paced the porch for hours after being banished from the bedroom, was finally allowed to enter. The look on his face when he saw Hannah cradling their son was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Awe, love, and gratitude all mingled together. "Hannah," he whispered, approaching the bed with reverent steps. "You did it. He's here." "Would you like to hold your son?" she asked, smiling despite her exhaustion. Jake carefully took the swaddled infant, his large hands suddenly seeming too big and rough for such a delicate task. But the baby settled against his father's chest as if he belonged there, his cries softening to gentle coos. "What shall we call him?" Jake asked, unable to take his eyes off the tiny face. Hannah had been considering names for months, but in this moment, only one felt right. "Thomas Jacob Northrop," she said softly, "to honor the past and celebrate the present." Jake looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Are you sure?" Hannah nodded. "Thomas gave me Emma and the courage to begin again after he was gone. You gave us a home, a family, a future. Our son should carry both legacies." Later that evening, after Dr. Wilson had departed with promises to return in a few days, Emma was allowed to meet her baby brother. Jake sat on the edge of the bed, the toddler on his lap, as they both gazed at the infant nursing at Hannah's breast. "Baby," Emma declared with authority, carefully touching the downy head with one finger. "That's right, sweetheart," Jake confirmed. "This is your brother, Thomas. Can you say Thomas?" Emma considered this challenge with a furrowed brow. "Tom," she finally pronounced, looking pleased with herself. Hannah and Jake exchanged smiles over her head. Tom it is then," Jake conceded, "at least until he's old enough to object." As dusk settled over the ranch, Jake arranged pillows behind Hannah's back and made sure she had water within reach. Emma had finally been persuaded to go to sleep in her own bed after extracting promises that the baby would still be there in the morning. "You should rest too," Hannah told Jake, noting the dark circles under his eyes. "You've been up since before dawn." "In a bit," he promised, settling into the chair beside the bed. "I just want to watch you both a little longer." Hannah understood the feeling. Despite her body's bone-deep exhaustion, she found herself fighting sleep, wanting to memorize every detail of this perfect moment, the weight of their son against her chest, the quiet satisfaction on Jake's face, the sense of completion that filled their small home. "I was thinking," Jake said after a comfortable silence, "with the cattle prices rising and that new land opening up to the west, we might be able to expand the ranch next year. Build a bigger house maybe, with a proper parlor for you and rooms for the children. Children plural." "Are you already planning more?" Hannah teased, though the idea wasn't unwelcome. She'd always dreamed of a large family. Jake grinned. "Well, little Tom here will need playmates, don't you think? Besides, I'm getting rather good at this fatherhood business." "That you are," Hannah agreed, watching as he gently stroked their son's cheek with one finger. "Though perhaps we could wait until this one is walking before we start on the next. Whatever you say, Mrs. Northrop, you're the boss." Jake's expression grew more serious. "I meant what I said about the house, though. You deserve a proper home, not just this cabin." Hannah looked around the simple room that had sheltered them through seasons of change. "This is a proper home, Jake. It has everything that matters." Her eyes found his in the lamplight. "But if you want to build something bigger, I won't object, as long as we do it together." "Together," Jake agreed, reaching for her hand. "Everything we do from now on, we do together." As summer gave way to fall and fall to winter, the Northrop Ranch continued to prosper. Little Thomas grew strong and healthy, his personality emerging as a blend of his parents' traits, Jake's easy laugh and Hannah's quiet determination. Emma became a devoted big sister, her natural protectiveness extending to the baby brother she still stubbornly called Tom, despite all attempts to correct her. True to his word, Jake began work on a larger house the following spring, a project that would continue in stages over the next 2 years as time and resources allowed. Hannah contributed to the design, insisting on practical features like a large kitchen with ample storage, wide porches to catch summer breezes, and bedrooms positioned to maximize natural light. Their family expanded again when Hannah's sister Rebecca arrived from Tennessee, a young widow seeking a fresh start after her husband's death in a mining accident. She moved into the original cabin once the main house was habitable, providing welcome help with the children and household while finding her own place in the growing community. 5 years after the flood that had changed everything, Hannah stood on the porch of their new home, watching Jake teaching a now 6-year-old Emma to ride her own pony while 4-year-old Thomas bounced with impatience, waiting for his turn. Their youngest, 2-year-old Margaret, named for Jake's sister, sat on a quilt nearby, contentedly playing with carved wooden animals. Hannah's hand rested unconsciously on her stomach, where the first fluttering movements of their 4th child had recently made themselves known. She hadn't told Jake yet, saving the news for his birthday celebration planned for that evening. The ranch had grown along with their family, now encompassing nearly 1,000 acres, with a respectable herd of cattle, and several fine horses that Jake had begun breeding with notable success. Their prosperity wasn't just measured in land and livestock, however, but in the community. They'd helped build neighbors who came together for barn raisings and harvests. The small school Jake had helped establish for the growing number of children in the area. The church they attended each Sunday, where Hannah now played the organ donated by a wealthy cattle buyer from Fort Worth. Yet for all they'd gained, Hannah never forgot what had brought them to this point. Each spring when the rains came and the brazos rose, she said silent prayers of gratitude for the life-giving water that nourished their land, for the flood that had washed away one life to make room for another, and for the man who had promised that she and her baby would live when all seemed lost. As if sensing her thoughts, Jake looked up from Emma's riding lesson and caught Hannah's eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as it had been that first night in the cabin, sent a familiar flutter through her heart. He said something to Emma, adjusted her grip on the reins, then made his way toward the porch while the children continued their riding practice under Rebecca's watchful eye. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Northrop," he asked, climbing the steps to stand beside her. Hannah leaned into him as his arm circled her waist. "I was just thinking about promises kept," she replied, turning her face up to his, "and lives well lived." Jake's kiss was gentle but carried the depth of feeling that had only grown stronger with each passing year. "The best decision I ever made was riding out to check fences during that storm," he murmured against her hair. Hannah smiled, thinking of the secret she would share with him that evening, the new life already growing within her. "The best decision I ever made was believing you when you said we'd live." As the Texas sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Hannah Northrop stood wrapped in her husband's embrace, watching their children play on land that had once been strange to her but was now unquestionably home. The river that had nearly taken everything had instead given her more than she could have imagined, not just survival, but a life overflowing with purpose, love, and the precious gift of beginning again.